would you go ahead and flip open in your Bibles, if you have not already, to Ephesians chapter 6. Okay, and this is going to be the interactive part of the sermon. We're going to have a little interview. All right, we're going to have us a little interview. Okay, I've got some questions. You have some answers. I'm going to interview you for a moment. So I'm going to start with this question, and I advise you, real quick, if you work for your dad and your dad is in the room, be very careful how you answer this. But here you are. How many of you have ever held a job that you didn't like very much? All right. Good little split there. Okay. How many of you have ever worked a job where you felt like maybe you were a little undervalued or even unappreciated by the person you were working for? Maybe a job where you felt like you were treated badly or even wronged in some way. Okay, pretty common experience there. Now let me ask you this. Here's the follow-up question to that. Did the way that you were treated at that job, did that in any way affect your attitude toward that job? Did it change things? I bet it did, yeah. Maybe your work ethic suffered. Maybe you just didn't kind of put as much effort into it. Maybe you were tempted to cut corners a little bit. Maybe you just didn't give it your best effort. Maybe you just didn't give it your best effort, and you were okay with that, and you justified that because, well, they don't appreciate me anyway. Let me tell you this. I have a boss right now at LSU who I consider to be one of the best bosses I've ever had. And I'm going to try to get him to listen to this sermon later. I have a boss at LSU that I consider to be one of the best bosses I've ever had. He cares, first of all, about my personal well-being. He doesn't just care that I do a good job. He cares about my personal well-being. He always asks about my family. He asks how the kids are doing. He's excited about the fact that I'm pastoring this church. He'll ask me on a regular basis, how's the church going? How are things like that doing? He proactively seeks to make sure that I'm happy with my job. He will ask me sometimes, how are you doing? Is it too much? I know we put a lot on you this week. How are you doing? Is there anything I can help with? Is there anything I can take off? Like, this is my boss asking me if there's anything he can take off of my plate. So anyway, great boss. Sadly, I have not always had bosses like that. Sadly, I have had jobs where my attitude suffered because of how I felt like I was being treated at that particular job. That has even happened to me. So I'll fess up right now. I will fess up right now. This sermon today has personally challenged me in a number of ways, and it's personally convicted me in some ways about how I have conducted myself in the past. In fact, this text today that we're about to look at, it has something to say for anybody who has ever been in that situation. If you will open your hearts and if you will open your minds and take this in, what we're going to be talking about here in a moment, this has the potential to drastically change the way that you approach your work. All of your work. Everything you do that is work. Our text today is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9. And I would even argue it will give you a renewed purpose and a renewed motivation about how you face even the really bad jobs. How you face even the really bad jobs. So if you have your Bibles open, please read along. And if not, the words, as always, will be behind me on the screen. Personal note, if I haven't brought this up in a while, I always would recommend you have a physical Bible with you when you come in here. I would always recommend that. We do put the words on the screen if you don't, but as you may have noticed, I will frequently refer back to the text during the sermon, and there's nothing like being able to look back down and follow along. So that's something we can't guarantee, is that the text will always be on the screen when I'm referring back to it. But also there's a bunch of reasons I would recommend you have a physical Bible with you in church. And in fact, in about 3 weeks or so, we're going to talk a lot more about that in detail. I'll save the rest for then. So anyway, Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9 is where we are this morning. Would you read with me, please? Paul says, "Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by way of eye service, as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." This is an incredible text. This is an incredible text. And allow me to just give you the main idea right up front. Here's the main idea of this text, and I'm just going to give it to you right up front. So if you got somewhere to be and you need to run out the door, here's the main idea. And you'll know the exact essence of the sermon today. No matter who you are, and no matter where you work, and no matter what job title you hold, Jesus Christ is your true master. He is the true master in the lives of all Christ followers. And how we conduct our business affairs is absolutely going to show to what level we follow him. That is the key point in our text today. Jesus Christ is our true master, and how we conduct our business affairs will absolutely reflect how we're following him. Furthermore, we should recognize that we are all equal before the Lord. Despite the way this text sounds on the surface level, we are all equal before the Lord. And everything we will see today flows out of these core truths. Everything we're going to see. And so if you can grasp this, no matter how you're being treated at work, no matter what kind of boss you have at work, no matter what your work experience has been, if you can grasp this, the fact that you have a true boss who oversees your earthly boss, and that he sees your work, and that he appreciates your work, and that he values your work, you need not feel ever dissatisfied or ever looked over or passed over again. To develop this thought, Paul is going to give us 8 traits. And this is how I've kind of broken down the sermon. 8 traits, 4 groups of 2. So don't worry, there's not 8 points to the sermon. 8 traits, 4 groups of 2. And here's how this is going to break down. Respect and sincerity, diligence and integrity, enthusiasm and perspective, and then finally, gentleness and equity. And that's kind of how we see Paul laying this out here today. And even though some of these instructions we're going to see are geared towards the bond servants, we're going to talk about the bond servants in a moment, and some of the instructions are geared more towards the masters. In effect, what I'm going to argue is we're all servants. And all of these instructions apply to all of us all the time. That's what I'm going to argue. There's a sense in which the text today is geared towards people who, from an earthly point of view, have this certain master-servant or master-bond-servant relationship, or even master-slave relationship. But when you step back, Paul's making a larger spiritual reality that says, well, that might be your earthly circumstances, but spiritually, you're all equals, and you should all be treating each other this way all the time. That's what we're going to see ultimately. But first, there is a big old elephant in the room. There's a big old elephant in the room, and we do need to kind of address this right up front, kind of get this out the way so that we can focus on what the text is saying and not be distracted with doubts and thoughts. And that's simply this. Some of you with Bibles in your laps that are looking down at your text, your Bible might not have said bondservant. When you heard me say bondservant, your translation might not have said bondservant. Your translation may have said slaves. Slaves, obey your masters. That's what you may have seen there. And there's a simple reason for that. A, 1/3 of the people in the Roman Empire at this time were slaves in some way, shape, or form. Okay, we just need to be clear about that. But the Greek word that Paul is using here to address his people, I don't usually go into the Greek specifically and tell you the Greek word. I will today. It's the Greek word doulos, and the word has a range of meanings depending on context. It can be a slave in the more traditional sense. It can be a servant, somebody that works for you, like a servant in your household. It can be what we call a bond servant, somebody who's working to pay off a debt. It has a wide range of uses here. And to be clear, all three of these types of people existed in the Roman Empire at this time. They had all three. And Paul is likely addressing all three. Here's why. Because who comes into the church? The people from the culture, right? That's who gets saved. That's who starts following the Lord. That's who comes in. Every one of us comes from a house, in a neighborhood, in a community, and it was no different in Rome, or in this case, in Ephesus. So what happens is you have people that live in a culture where 1/3 of the people are slaves already, and they get saved, and they start coming to church. And all of a sudden, you have people in the church who have slaves at home. Or you have people in the church who are slaves. Or you have people in the church who are bondservants. Or you have people in the church who are servants. And so what you do then, though, is as you pull the people into the church, then you have to start dealing with what's going on outside. Because we don't force people to fix every single issue that they're dealing with before they can come in. I don't say to you, you can't come through that door until you fix this, and that's not how this works. We don't spray you down with a garden hose on the front steps so that you can be worthy to come in here. We bring you in and we love on you, and we let Jesus clean you up while you worship with us. And so Paul does the same thing. Paul is letting these people in, and these people are already there. And in some cases, you have a master and a servant sitting next to each other listening to this, and they're in the church. And so this has to be addressed. But even in that, there's a way that you conduct yourselves. There's a way that you conduct yourselves in all of our relationships, and that's what we've been seeing. So Paul's addressing all these groups. But the big question, the question that comes up because of passages like this is, does the Bible condone the practice of slavery? Because when I read a passage like this, it sure sounds like it. Masters or slaves obey your masters, bondservants obey your masters. It sure sounds like that sometimes. Does the Bible endorse slavery? I'm going to give you a very simple answer to that question. No. Let me be very clear with you. The Bible nowhere endorses the practice of slavery. It deals with slavery as a reality with which these people lived, but the nightly news deals with murder as a reality with which we live. Just because the news talks about murder doesn't mean the news endorses murder. And just because the Bible addresses people who happen to already be slaves doesn't mean the Bible endorses slavery. The answer is no. Slavery in all of its forms, and there have been multiple forms. All right, what we practice here in America, the atrocity that existed here in America until the year 1865, which wasn't that long ago if you think about it, the atrocity that existed here is one subset of a much larger institution that has existed throughout all of society, all of human culture since the dawn of man. It's existed in various shapes, forms, and sizes, and we even had it here for a time. But nowhere does it endorse it. In fact, I think some of our aversion to this is we hear this, and then we hear the word slave or we hear the word bondservant, and we think of the atrocity of Americanized slavery, and it's all an atrocity, don't get me wrong, but we think about what was happening here, like not that long ago, and we think, oh, Paul must be endorsing that. Paul must be telling those men in the fields, you better work, you better do what, and we think that he's somehow saying that. Let me just be very clear. When Paul uses the word doulos, he is not at all endorsing this. He's not. In fact, if you go read 1 Timothy chapter 1, also written by Paul, he explicitly calls out human trafficking as an abomination and a sin and something to not do. He explicitly calls that out. If you go look at Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, when God is in the process of handing down the law to his people, he explicitly tells Moses, Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, go look it up. He explicitly tells Moses, any person who would ever go and kidnap a man in order to sell him to someone else should be put to death. That is what God told Moses. That is what they codified in their law. So no, we're not endorsing slavery here. So what is actually happening? Why does he word it this way? Why is he saying it like this? For one thing, many of the people Paul was addressing with the word doulos in this passage were actually more like what we today would call bond servants or indentured servants. Meaning, I owed you a debt. I have no other way to pay it off. I'm going to work for you for a specific period of time to pay off the debt. During that time, I'm technically your slave, if you want to think of it that way. But once I've paid off the debt, I'm free. I'm basically working for you. Not all, but many of the people, that's what their situation was. And look, even though it sounds like I am, but I'm really not going to do a detailed analysis of slavery in the Roman Empire during the writing of Ephesus, I do want to say this. A lot of people are going to ask the question, and it's a fair question. They will say, well then, if what you're saying is true, why did he not just say slavery is abolished? Why did Paul not just say be done with it altogether? My response to that, well, for one thing, he never had the political power or authority to do that. He couldn't have done that. But ultimately, what we're going to see is that's kind of what he did. We just don't quite see it. But that's exactly what he was doing, because he was slick about it. He was slick about it. For him to just come out and say something like that, well, could have gotten his head chopped off, for one thing. But he was slick about it. And this is what Paul did. Paul attacked slavery at the root level, and he eroded it from the inside. That's what Paul did. Paul did it by starting, with passages like we see here, by changing the way the masters and the slaves, or the masters and the servants, related to each other. He started at that foundational level by challenging and overthrowing the notion that one person was more important than another simply because of where they happened to fall in the pecking order. How many of you remember the fact that I came back from Washington, D.C. recently? Okay, I've talked about that. While we were in Washington, D.C., one of the first places we visited was Mount Vernon. Talked about that. Mount Vernon was George Washington's home. That's where George Washington lived when he was president, and then after he was president and came back. While we were there, and this is still going on today, they're actually in the process right now of remodeling that house. What they're doing is they're taking the basement and they're revamping and they're remodeling the basement to make it part of the exhibit, because there's actually some history down there too, and the basement has never been part of the tour. They want the basement to be part of the tour, so they're doing some remodeling down there. But they can't just go around and start knocking down walls and tearing stuff up in the basement, because guess what's going to happen? The whole house will come down. So you can't just go down and start tearing stuff up. So what they've done is they've sectioned off a part of the house. They've taken it and they've removed it from the tour. They've sectioned it off. They actually removed the floor in that whole section so that they can get to the basement, and they're going down there and they're doing their renovations and they're fixing what they need to fix and structuring what they need to stretch, and they're doing all this excavation and stuff like that. And then what they're actually going to do, and they told us this on the tour, is when they finish what they need to finish in that section, they're going to put the floor back, and then they're going to section off a different part of the house and start the process over. This is going on right now, today. They're doing this right now. So somebody's going to go to D.C. in a few months, and like 2/3 of the house is going to be off limits because it's sectioned off. So we got there just in time. But here's the thing. Sometimes when you need to overhaul a system, you can't just start tearing down walls. You have to be more strategic about it. And that is what Paul's doing here. That's how Paul dismantles the institution of slavery, by sectioning off some parts of the house so he can do some foundation work. And just to be clear, it's working. It's working. As Christianity spreads across the Roman Empire, we're drastically going to see attitudes towards slavery and that whole thing. It's going to start changing drastically. The whole system is going to start weakening, and eventually the system is going to end. And in fact, that has been the experience throughout history everywhere the gospel has been shared. Every country that has embraced Christianity has tended towards more democratic forms of government and has tended away from forms of exploitation. The parts of the world right now where you still see the most exploitation are the parts where the gospel has been rejected. And I'm not going to talk about the specific countries, but you know which ones they are. So the simple fact is, while the Bible does address slavery, it does not endorse slavery, and Paul does not condone slavery. This passage has nothing to do with upholding slavery. This passage has everything to do with how we as Christ followers honor and serve the Lord through our work and our work ethic, regardless of where we find ourselves in the pecking order, and regardless of who our boss is, and regardless of where we happen to find ourselves. That is what this passage is about. So the first set of traits we look at this morning is respect and sincerity. Okay, in verse 5, Paul says, obey your masters. In modern times, this would pretty much include anybody who has legitimate authority over you. So think about a boss, think about a supervisor, think about a foreman, think about stuff like that. Obey your masters, and then he adds, with fear and trembling and a sincere heart. Fear and trembling and a sincere heart. Just to be clear, he's not talking about terror. He's not telling you to quake in your boots when he sees the boss coming. Fear and trembling, you may remember there's other passages in other places of the New Testament where we're told to fear the Lord. All right, this is a respect. All right, this is a sense of respect and giving honor to somebody. It's a term meaning show them respect. He also says to do this with a sincere heart. And that's where the sincerity comes in. That is where we get the respect and the sincerity. But notice he also says, as you would the Lord. As you would the Lord. And maybe you noticed, as I was reading through that passage, every single verse says something like that. Every single verse makes a reference to the Lord, makes a reference to Jesus. Except for verse 9, which doesn't say it explicitly, but I would say it says the same thing, just with different words. But 5, 6, 7, and 8 all make that point. As you would the Lord, or some variation of it. We'll talk more about that as we go through those verses, but pay attention to that. This is the theme that Paul is going to keep developing in this letter. This is his theme, that all of our work should be done as if we're doing it to the Lord himself. Okay, our second set of traits is going to be diligence and integrity. Diligence and integrity. In verse 6, Paul goes on to say, not by the way of eye service. That's an interesting way to word that in the ESV, eye service. But depending on what translation of the Bible you have, your translation might say, while you're being watched. Or maybe it just says, while his eye is on you. I hope you get the point. Either way, what Paul is talking about is, well, integrity. Don't just work hard when you know the boss is watching. I remember in my younger days sitting in the chair. Uh-oh, here comes Dr. whatever his name was that I used to work for at the pet clinic place. And I jump up. You know, it's just like, I can't be sitting down when the boss is coming. Don't just work hard. In all fairness, my other supervisor told me that day that we had some downtime and it was okay. But I still got nervous when I saw the boss coming and I knew I wasn't doing anything. So the idea is, I was also much, much younger. Don't just work hard when the boss is around, and don't just work hard when you're being watched. That is what he's getting at here. So we're going to resume our job interview this morning that we already started. And I'm asking you to be honest. You know, we're not a place that judges, but, you know, we're a place that shares our sins and confesses our sins and shares with one another in love and acceptance and all of those good things. So show of hands, let's be honest. How many people in here at some point have seen the boss coming and you hurried up to stop whatever you were doing and start doing something else? How many of us have done that? All right. Okay. Yes. Thank you for your honesty. X out of solitaire as quick as you can. Close Minesweeper. Hang up the phone. Hurry, I gotta go. Scramble to do all those things. Close the book, throw the book in your desk, whatever it was. You saw the boss coming, you did that. Okay. I'm actually reminded right now of the network television stations. And, when sweeps would come around, you remember sweeps? Nobody talks about sweeps too much anymore in my experience because we're all watching Hulu and Netflix and Amazon Prime. But we used to watch TV and sweeps would come around. You remember sweeps? That's the time of year when they would really start crunching the numbers on the Nielsen ratings. and like really crunching that data to see who was watching the shows, to see like which shows, oh, well, maybe we'll cancel this one, whatever. Well, every year or every time of year when sweeps came around, what would happen? All of a sudden, television got really, really good. They would put on their best episodes. That's when the character would get killed off, or that's when the other character would mysteriously come back and you thought they were dead, or that's when they would start tackling the big... But all of a sudden, for those week or two, all of a sudden television got really, really good because they knew everybody was watching. This would be an example of putting on your best work only when you know you're being watched and only when you know you're under that extra scrutiny of the people you answer for. And Paul's saying, don't do any of that stuff. Paul says in verse 6, don't be people pleasers. That's what they're doing. They're trying to please the people when that happens. He says, don't work as people pleasers, but work as bondservants of Christ. You see, there it is again in verse 6. As bondservants of Christ. Work as you would as if you were working for Christ. Because guess what? He's the boss. He's the real boss. And if you'll skip down to verse 8 for a second, we'll come back to it in a minute officially, but if you'll skip down to verse 8 for a second, you'll see Paul says, whatever good anyone does will be repaid to him by who? The Lord. There it is again. By the Lord. Hey, how about a truth bomb? Ready for one? We went this whole time with no truth bombs. Truth bomb number 1. Even if your earthly boss isn't watching, your true boss is. So whoever your supervisor is, even if your earthly boss isn't watching, your true boss is. So if you work one way while being watched, and you work some other way when you're not, then this is the part in the text where I would invite you to erase that discrepancy. Because, my LSU boss might not always be standing there looking at me. In fact, I spend most of my time, working independently and doing my own thing. But even if your earthly boss isn't watching, you keep in mind you have a higher boss than him, and that boss is always watching. That's not meant to scare anybody or make you paranoid, but it's true. Your true boss is always watching. Our third trait is going to be enthusiasm and perspective. Paul tells us when we render this service to render it with a good heart. Render it with a good will. A good will. All right, some translations may say good attitude. Other translations will just say wholeheartedly. Either way, this is your attitude and this is your enthusiasm toward your work, whatever you're doing. Verse 8, and as to who? The Lord. There it is again. See how this keeps coming up over and over? And then verse 8 says, knowing. So now here we're getting to, in other words, he's saying, keep this in mind, remember this, be aware of this, which gets at our perspective. Paul says, knowing whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is bondservant or free. Whatever good anyone does, he will get repaid by the Lord. Did you catch that? Did you catch what he's saying there? The Lord sees, and the Lord will reward you for a sincere effort. The Lord sees. Maybe your boss doesn't see you. Maybe he doesn't seem to appreciate or care. The Lord sees you. He will see that you get your reward. Let that encourage you. The Lord rewards sincere work. Your heavenly boss will make sure that you are fairly compensated for your work. He will. So get your satisfaction from that and work like you mean it. But even in that, he says, render this service as to the Lord and not to man. Truth bomb number 2. We should perform every task as if Jesus himself were the customer and as if he will personally benefit or suffer based on our performance. I try to keep these as short as I can, but sometimes there's no other way to do it. We should perform every task as if Jesus himself were the customer and as if he will personally benefit or suffer based on our performance. What do I mean by that? What does that mean? Just what it says. Work like Jesus is your customer. Okay? That car that comes into the body shop, Jesus brought that car in, and Jesus is going to drive that car home. And if you cut corners, Jesus is the one who's going to get into an accident. That's what he's saying. He's the one you're selling that product to. So if you cheat him or if you sell him an inferior product, he's going to get hurt because of it. But if you give him a good deal, he's the one that's going to be blessed. Or if you sell him something genuine, he's the one ordering food from you at the restaurant. So if you don't care and you're like, oh, I'll just get to it when I get to it, he's the one sitting there thirsty. That's what we're talking about. And likewise, it's Jesus who is going to benefit if you do your job well, and it's Jesus who's going to suffer if you don't. Jesus is that kid sitting in your classroom. And if you don't put your heart and soul into it, Jesus is going to walk out of that classroom saying, I don't know anything more than when I came in here. And another one, students. There's some students in the room. Listen, if you go to class and you're studying and you're taking a class, you sit through that class and you apply yourself as if Jesus himself is your teacher. And if you don't do your part, and if you don't care, it is Jesus who's going to get in trouble with the school board when they start doing performance evaluations. That is how you approach your classwork. That is how you approach your studies. That is what we're talking about here. You do your best. Do you get the point? Do you get the point? Do you? I want some heads to shake. Okay. Listen, I've prayed all week that you would get this point. All right. I've prayed every day. I have sat down to prep for the sermon, and I'll do like 45 to 60 minutes a day at least throughout the week. And every time I sit down to pray, I mainly pray for two things: that the Lord will open my heart and my mind to take in the truth of this passage, and to give me the words to communicate it. And then I will pray, on the other hand, that he will open your hearts and minds to take this in and to be changed by it, so that when you walk out those doors, you're a better Christ follower and you're a better person. And I've been praying for you all week about this. And just to be clear, like I keep saying, and like I've said over and over and over again in recent weeks, listen, I'm not talking about perfection. I am not talking about perfection. I am talking about the quality of your effort and the attitude of your heart. Because we all mess up on the job even, but I'm talking about the attitude of your heart and the quality of your effort. Okay? Notice I didn't say if you forget to bring Jesus' water. I said when I was doing the example of the person bringing the food, I didn't say if you're serving another table and he's sitting there waiting for his water. I said, if you think to yourself, I'll get to it when I get to it. I'm talking about your attitude and how you approach your job. Our fourth trait is going to be gentleness and equity. Gentleness and equity. Now, interestingly, this is the only trait specifically addressed to the masters. Everything else was addressed to the servants. But remember what I said earlier, about Paul eroding the practice of slavery from the inside, and how he got to the heart of the matter and started destroying it from the inside. Because he starts by saying, Masters, look at verse 9. Masters, do the same to them. That is how he starts that instruction there. Do the same to them. Every trait that we have talked about so far, up to this point, every one of them, the respect, the sincerity, the diligence, the integrity, the enthusiasm, the perspective, every one of those traits is what he's referring back to. Do the same to them. Why? Because it is a two-way street. It is a two-way street. Think about it. In a culture where you as the master were legally allowed to basically treat your slaves or your servants however you wanted, and where it was not uncommon to see some actual cruelty going down. Yes, that happened. Surprise, surprise. There were masters who were cruel to their servants and cruel to their slaves. In a society where you could do that and get away with it because they were considered property and had very few rights, in a society where you could get away with whatever you wanted, Paul says that you had better behave the way toward your servant that you expect your servant to behave around you. And this would have been unlike anything they had ever heard. Whatever respect and diligence and obedience and humility and sincerity and integrity and passion and work ethic and all of those things, whatever you were expecting them to show towards you because they worked for you, Paul says do the same thing back to them and show it right back to them. And they would have heard nothing like this anywhere in their culture up to that point. Treat them the exact same way you expect them to behave towards you. All the honor and the respect that you think you deserve, show that same honor and respect to everybody who works for you. Show it to them. Stop your threatening, he even says in verse 9. Stop your threatening. There's gentleness. That's our first of the two traits. Knowing, he says, that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. There's your equity. There's your equity. If the employer should get the very best version of the employee should also get the very best version of the employer. You give them your very best just as you expect their very best. Truth bomb number 3. In God's corporation, where we fall on the corporate ladder is meaningless. In God's corporation, I've taken to thinking of it as Godco. If you work for Godco, which we all do, where you happen to fall on the corporate ladder on any given season is meaningless. No matter how high you are up on the pecking order, there is always somebody higher. And we all answer to the highest one, which kind of flattens the corporate ladder if you think about it. If we supervise others, and some of us do, maybe, some of us do at least, we are not to view them as inferior or lesser based on their job function. They might answer to you on the job, but they are not subservient to you. How we treat authority and how we treat those we have authority over is a sign of our character. Think about that. And how we conduct our work, regardless of what side of the desk we sit on, that's a sign of our integrity. So that door swings both ways. Paul says we all serve the same master. So ultimately, we're all co-workers. We are all co-workers. And with him, he says there is no partiality. There is no favoritism. There's no partiality. So an employee messes up really bad on the job one day. I mean, he just messes up bad. And the foreman is furious. He's furious. And he's about to bring the hammer of God down on this unfortunate soul. He is ready to go out there and give it to him. And then right before he heads out to confront this poor guy, the foreman's assistant pulls him aside and he says, sir, just be careful. That's the owner's son. That's the owner's son. All of a sudden, everything's different. All of a sudden, the tune changes. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. We all make mistakes. We all mess up. We'll clean this up. We'll fix it. It's okay. You're still learning. Don't worry about it. Now, a minute ago, you were going to kill this dude. Now, we're walking on eggshells. What happened? Well, that is an example of favoritism. That is an example of partiality. Knowing that this guy was the son of the boss allowed him to get the benefit of a doubt. It allowed him to get better treatment. Are you ready to have your mind blown, people? Friends? Family? Are you ready to have your mind blown? Shake your head yes if you're ready to have your mind blown. All right. Here you go. Everybody that you come into contact every day is the son or the daughter of the owner. Every one of them. They're all the son or the daughter of the owner. And Paul would tell us, if he were here reading this text to us and commenting on it himself, he would tell us, treat them like it. Treat them like it. That is what he would say. They work for you? No, you both work for God. Treat them like it. That is what we're to take away from this in part. So here's what we've seen today. Paul went to great lengths to show us that whatever our earthly circumstances, whatever they happen to be, whatever side of the desk we sit on, we all work for one boss. That's the first thing we need to keep in mind. And that one boss is fair and that one boss is impartial. All right. Secondly, this one boss looks with favor upon those who reflect his fairness and his impartiality. And that's where all these traits come in that we've looked at this morning. All of them. The diligence, the respect, the sincerity, the diligence, the integrity, the enthusiasm, the perspective, the gentleness, the equity. That's where all of those traits come in. He looks with favor on those who would show those traits in their dealings. And he sees. He sees your faithfulness, and he sees your sincerity. He sees your integrity. That's what Paul's telling us here. He sees. Even if the other boss doesn't see, and there are things that can fly under the radar that he doesn't catch, the big boss sees it all. And he says there will be a reward. Maybe in this life, maybe in this life there will be a reward. There will definitely be a reward in the next life. Maybe even in both. But he says there will be a reward for those who work diligently here as for the Lord. That's what he's telling us. This gets to our work ethic. So maybe you've had a bad job. Maybe you've had a job where your boss didn't care, or your boss didn't see you, or maybe you're in that job now. Maybe that's your lot in life at this moment. Maybe your boss doesn't appreciate you. Maybe he undervalues you. Maybe he doesn't care enough about you. Guess what? He's not really your boss. He's not real. Paul is telling us he's not really your boss. Your real boss, he sees your work. He appreciates your work. He values your work. And when the time is right, he will reward your work. And so we move forward from that feeling like, you know what? I can do this. I can do this. Maybe you even feel like your work is meaningless. Well, does it really matter what I do? Let me just be clear. Because a corollary to this is simply this. No honest or honorable work is meaningless. That's the other part of this. No honest, no honorable work is meaningless. There are professions that are not honest and not honorable, or maybe not honest and not honorable. I'm not talking about those, but any honest, honorable work is meaningful. Meaningful, if you remember who you're really working for. If you remember that. And so let that encourage you in all that you do. Let that keep you moving forward. Just keep asking yourself. Just keep asking yourself. You might have to do this daily. You might have to do this hourly. You might have to do this every 30 minutes. Every time the boss makes his rounds, you might have to do this. Ask yourself this question: who do I work for? And then you answer it: I work for the Lord. Amen. And everyone said? Amen. Amen.